Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Randwick City Live and Online. My name is Georgina Keep, Local Studies Librarian at Randwick City Library. It gives me great pleasure to open our second live online History Week talk this evening. Firstly, though, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which Randwick City Library stands, and also wherever each of us are located today. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. A few technical housekeeping tips for those of you who have not joined us before in our Zoom online events to date. The best part about using Zoom is your ability for our community to engage with our guests and our guest speakers directly. There will be time for Q&A towards the end of the presentation. You can type your question at any stage using the Q&A feature. When it's time for the audience Q&A session, I will read out as many questions for Dr. O'Neill to answer as we have time to include. Right now though, everyone's sound and video has been disabled and will remain that way for the duration of our event. You will not be able to activate these features throughout the event. At the end of the presentation by Dr. O'Neill and after audience Q&A time, we will have a quick survey poll to get your feedback on today's events. We would be grateful if you can fill it out so that we know how to improve and what we have done well for subsequent planning. Tonight though, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Marjorie O'Neill MP for Coogee in the New South Wales Parliament. In her maiden speech to Parliament in May 2019, Marjorie proudly acknowledged that she was a fifth generation Bronte girl of Irish Anglo heritage, but with a bit of Polish thrown in. Marjorie is one of 5 children to parents Kerry Spooner and the late Brian O'Neill. She was educated at St Charles's Waverley and St Vincent's Potts Point. She went on to obtain a BA from Wollongong University, a Bachelor of Business with Honours from the University of Technology, Sydney, and ultimately a PhD in Management Economics from Macquarie University, a substantial academic credential. She credits her parents with instilling in their children the value of education, hard work, and the importance of supporting minimum rights for workers. The O'Neill family values of supporting social justice and the Catholic faith were the major influences in Marjorie's early life. We could not help but notice last week at our rehearsal that Marjorie is very excited about sharing her memories of growing up in the eastern suburbs. Especially close to her heart are the many hazy days that generations of her family have spent in our glorious Clovelly Cove, or Little Coogee, as it was originally known. Following an illustrious tradition of local politicians who have generously shared their family histories with us at in-person events at the Lionel Bowen Library, I am convinced we will all find personal synergies with Marjorie's family history and her recollections this evening. I have been looking forward to this event all year, so it is my absolute privilege to welcome Dr. Marjorie O'Neill to share her family history. Good evening and welcome, Marjorie. How are you this evening?
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm having a really wonderful time, and I'm really excited about this evening. So,
thank you very much. Without further ado, I will let you get on with your presentation.
Thank you. This is an incredibly special opportunity for me to be able to share this. My history, my family history with everyone here. I am 5th generation from the eastern suburbs. My nieces are the 6th generation. I hope that you enjoy this evening. Now, just so before we do start, I do want to sort of share something with you, which hopefully will give you some humour, but it means that a little bit, I ask that you do pay attention. My full name is Marjorie Bridget Spooner O'Neill, Spooner being my middle name, O'Neill being my surname, and Bridget being my confirmation name. And I say this to you because, as you will learn throughout the evening, my family lacks originality when it comes to naming all of us, but it also means you need to pay attention because there are quite a few people throughout this story that have very similar names to each other. So what was already said, I'm a 5th generation born Australian of almost completely Irish descent. My father grew up in Bexley North area, and his family had mainly come from around Rosebery since they migrated from Ireland in the late 1800s. Dad himself migrated to the eastern suburbs when he married my mother in 1977. And the photo that you should be looking at now is actually the wedding of my parents in 1977. They got married in Reed Street in Bronte at the back of my mother's parents' house. And I think it's interesting as we sort of look at this photo and we think about not only is the photo a clear capture of the 70s and of a time, as you can see, but also as we sort of look at the photo and we think about how our social norms have changed quite a fair bit. You would be pretty hard pressed, I think, these days to find a wedding take place in somebody's backyard. Now, my mother's family were all Eastern Suburbs based from the early 1900s. My grandfather, Thomas Spooner, was raised in Paddington until he married my maternal grandmother, Marjorie O'Neill, who then became Spooner, who lived her life in Luger Street, Waverley, with her mother Mary, and her grandmother Bridget, who is known as Birdie, just 2 blocks from where I also live these days in a 3-generation household. So 6 generations of women in my family have lived in a very small area. And you should be looking at 2 photos now. And the photo in the left, which is a black and white photo, is the photo of my mother. So the small baby, if we go from right to left, the small baby is my mother, Kerry. The woman holding her is her mother, Marjorie. The woman to the left of Marjorie is Mary, and the woman to the left of Mary is Birdie or Bridget. And that photo is taken at number 18 Luger Street. While the other photo on your right, which is a colourful photo, so in the back of that photo, the dark-headed girl is a girl by the name of Leah, who is my older brother, who is sitting next to her fiance. There is also in that photo my mother, Kerry. It is then next to Kerry is my older sister, Bridget, whom I am sitting next to. And then in front of Bridget is my niece, Laura. So in quite a few, in sort of 3 generations, we have quite similar households, but not living that far away from each other. Now, when my mother's parents married, they moved to Beach Street, Clovelly, and then later to Carrington Road, Randwick, where my mother and her siblings all grew up. And the photo that you are now looking at is my mother, Kerry, is the one on the right with the blonde hair and the hand on her face. And to her left is her sister, Kim Spooner. And this is at number 3 Beach Street. And I think this is a really lovely photo and quite timely. And as we sort of look at the photo, we can really take in and think about how much the eastern suburbs has changed. Even thinking about how the fences of the houses have changed, how the fronts of the streets have changed, the way little children dress, the fences between households. It's a really, really lovely and cute photo, but Beach Street does not look like that, like this these days. Now, when my mother's parents married, they moved to Beach Street later, and then to Carrington Road, where my mother and siblings all grew up, as I just said. As a child, my mother's father, who's Tom Spooner, was a fireman based at Randwick Fire Station. My mother's parents, Tom Spooner and Marjorie Spooner, bought a news agency in Charing Cross in the late 1960s and worked 7 days a week, mainly from 5 a.m. to 7 p.m. in order to see their 7 surviving children educated. And the photo that we're now looking at now is a photo, again, of my mother, Kerry, and her sister, Kim. And this is a photo of my mother's first day of school at St. Anthony's in the 1950s with her little sister. And what I really love about this photo is, and I think, again, these are real photos of a time, and they capture it, not only the tiles on the ground, but also very much having a look at the school uniforms. As I was sort of going to work today, I took a moment to think about all the school uniforms in the eastern suburbs, and as I was driving through, and increasingly you were seeing less and less girls wearing dresses. Even the fact that pants have become very much the fashion for both girls and boys with all school uniforms. But that's a really lovely photo. And again, I think one of the things when you look out of this photo with Beach Street, that I think you would notice is the lack of trees that are in the photo, which, and I'll talk about this a little bit later as we go on. I think one of the things that has changed a lot about the eastern suburbs over the last few decades is we've seen increasing numbers of trees, which I think is a really, really wonderful thing. When my grandparents sold the news agency, they moved their family home to Reed Street, Bronte. Marjorie went on to establish a career for herself as a sales assistant in women's shoes at Grace Brothers, Bondi Junction. And I'm proud to say that she was also the union delegate for the Shop Distributors and Allied Employments Association, a union which my father at the time was the secretary. Now, lots of relatives of mine have lived in this area. My mother is the eldest of 8 children, and some of them still live locally. No one forgets anything in my family. That's right, there were 8 children. Christopher, the 6th born, unfortunately died, and I have a brother and nephew that are named after him. My great auntie Jan lived in Bishops Avenue in Randwick at one time, and my auntie Kim lived in a flat where the Royal Randwick is now. My great uncle Ron and auntie Audrey, whose surname is Reed, brought their family up in Shackle Avenue, Clovelly, and there are many other uncles, aunties and cousins that are living in the area. The story of my family is very much situated in this place. My mother's childhood was spent at Burnie Park and at Clovelly Beach. Mr. Caddy taught them all how to swim in Clovelly Pool. My grandfather Tom was washed off the rocks at Clovelly when fishing and nearly died, probably numerous times. My aunts and uncles abound with horrific tales of being out on wooden boats without life jackets and nearly capsizing around Wedding Cake Island and the local cliffs. My uncle Michael broke his leg playing for Souths as a schoolboy, which made my grandmother incredibly proud as being a South supporter herself. Now, this is despite the fact that her uncle, Gordon Favell, played first grade for the Roosters, and his Roosters number is 241. So I'll just talk a moment about this photo that you're looking at right now. And this is a photo of my mother and some of her siblings and her father at Clovelly Beach. So in this photo is my mother, Kerry. To the right of her is her sister, Kim, and her 3 brothers, Michael, Mitchell and Mark, and her father. And I think it's a really lovely photo. And even though the world has changed, Clovelly is still an incredibly popular place today for where to take young children because it is so safe. There's one other photo I just want to sort of show with you right now. As we were just talking about there in terms of the conflict between Souths and Roosters, this is a conflict that still very much exists within my family today. We do not have conflict in my family over religion or politics. It is all based around rugby league. And again, my great uncle, Gordon Favell, played for the Roosters. Now, despite that, his niece was a massive Rooster supporter, or massive South supporter, sorry. But this same conflict still exists in my family today. Despite the fact that the vast majority of us are Rooster supporter, there is always a South supporter that likes to present themselves. Now, there is hardly a family story that does not revolve around the eastern suburbs. My family has been here in the eastern suburbs for 6 generations. Now, except for very short periods, my family has always lived south of Bondi Road, north of Coogee Bay Road, and east of Anzac Parade. I am the middle of 5, and when I was born, my home was in Hewlett Street, Bronte. When I was 10 years old, my family moved to Yanko Avenue in Bronte, just a short distance, but a world away. Hewlett Street was very suburban with just one corner shop, while Yanko Avenue was on the edge of a shopping strip with the Bronte RSL. When we lived in Hewlett Street, we gravitated towards Bondi Road for our Friday night family dinners at the China Moon. But at Yanko Avenue, the Bronte RSL with the Chinese restaurant became our once a week night out. And the photo that there's a number of photos that I'm just sort of showing you now, which is in the middle, the first photo is a photo of my father and the 4 oldest of us. So I am the one wearing the little red jacket. Above me is my older sister, Bridget. The little baby to my right is my sister, Mary, and then that is my brother, Christopher, and my father, Brian, is there. The photo to the right of the one in the middle is my eldest brother, Christopher, who is holding my youngest brother, Francis, who was born at St. Margaret's, and that is my sister, Mary. The photo up in sort of the right-hand corner is the 5 of us, which was taken last year. The 5 of us are all very close. And the photo at the bottom is a photo of us at my younger sister Mary's wedding. And again, I think about how things like our social norms around weddings have changed immensely. And this photo of us at my sister's wedding is it's a huge juxtaposition compared to the wedding that my parents had. My sister's wedding would be regarded as incredibly glamorous and over the top, where my parents' wedding, which was in Reed Street, was very humble and lovely. And yeah, I just think it's interesting to think as the world has changed and how we live our lives has changed, how so many of our social norms and celebrations have also changed as well. Now, I have to say, I have some of the most wonderful memories of my childhood. Most of them are going up to the parks and playing in the Bronte Gully, a few doors up from my home in Hewlett Street, and running all the way down to the beach. It would be quite often on hot summer days and hot summer nights, we would be having dinners at Clovelly Beach, or spending time with my grandfather at the Royal Randwick, and of countless hours playing netball at almost every field in the eastern suburbs, usually with my father watching me. There's also a very strong sense of community and freedom within the eastern suburbs. We knew our neighbours, and it was usually for us kids, it was really pretty typical for us kids to get on BMX bikes and go down to the park for hours and hours without any adult supervision. Now, some of my fondest memories growing up were playing hide and seek in the Bronte Gully and playing on the wonderful playgrounds across the eastern suburbs on equipment that would be deemed very unsafe by today's standards. Now, my mother started primary school at St. Anthony's, where my sister now teaches, but moved to St. Charles in Waverley with her siblings. Her brothers went to Marcelin in Randwick, while the girls went to St. Clair's. Like my sisters and brothers and my now nieces, I commenced primary school at St. Charles. We drove or walked to school. We had burgers and milkshakes in Charing Cross and did our sports at Waverley Heffron and at Waverley Oval and at Heffron. And the photos that you are now looking at on the left is a photo of my younger sister, Mary, and I. We are 13 months apart at St. Charles in year 5 and year 4. And the photo to the right is of my older brother playing rugby league for St. Charles. And Vicky's Hair Affair was the big sponsor of St. Charles Rugby League team during that time. And if you've been around the eastern suburbs for long enough, you would know Vicky's Hair Affair, incredibly popular hairdressing salon in Charing Cross for quite a long time. Now, all of my life, I've been incredibly connected to this locality. Family differences were, as I said, more often about whether or not what rugby league team that you supported. Our natural centre of gravity was to move south. To Coogee or Clovelly Beach and pubs has always been a much more logical destination than to Bondi. Arden Street has been very, very well traversed by my family. But what have I seen change the most? Well, a lot of things have changed in the eastern suburbs during my life. There are obviously a lot more people living and visiting the area. Increasing housing density contributed to the growth in local numbers, while fixing the sewage outlet has also increased the popularity of the area to outside visitors. There is more traffic and more cars, and sadly, public transport systems have deteriorated somewhat in recent years. There are also more cafes and restaurants and bars. Indeed, there is a lot more to do. Our lifestyles have changed. In my childhood, eating out once a week was a special treat, and often this meant going to either Pizza Hut in Bondi Junction, followed by Dr. Watt, or eating Chinese and getting takeaway. But again, it would be once a week. I have absolutely no memory at all growing up of my parents purchasing a takeaway coffee on a regular basis, or even buying breakfast out. A very typical weekend breakfast for us would be my father going up to the shops and getting croissants getting croissants from the local store. We would never, ever in our mind have thought about going out and having smashed avocado on toast. When I turned 18, going to the Coogee Bay Hotel or the Palace for drinks on a Saturday night was possible in shorts, t-shirts and thongs, while today it is a fashion parade. The cake shops with meat pies and sausage rolls have been replaced by coffee shops, while the hamburger and barbecue chicken joints have become chains and salad bars. The area has been gentrified to some extent. Lots of poorer people have been driven out. The old flats and subdivided big homes were pulled down to build shopping areas such as the Royal Randwick and blocks of new apartments. In many cases, the poor and those with disabilities have been replaced by backpackers or upwardly mobile young people. We've seen our hospitals grow, including right now, we're seeing the Prince of Wales and Sydney Children's Hospital being expanded. We've also seen the movement of the Royal Women's Hospital to Randwick in the late 80s. And just so that people are aware, here is my proof. I have been to the Sydney Children's Hospital. This is probably one of the first surgeries that I've ever had. And I am a huge advocate of the Sydney Children's Hospital. It is absolutely wonderful. And as someone who has been a reciprocate of the great doctors that are there, I think we are incredibly lucky to have such a wonderful hospital so close to where we live. But again, to some extent in my own life, things have not changed that much. And I've got this wonderful photo here. In my life, very similar to my mum, my life still revolves around Clovelly Beach. And an ideal summer day to me is one spent with my family down at the beach. And the black and white photo that you are looking at in the middle is a photo of my mother, Kerry, with her little sister, Kim. And the photos on left or right are with me, with my eldest niece, Matilda, and with my younger niece, Laura. And I think what's really lovely when you look at this is, even though the world has changed, our life has always revolved around Clovelly. And again, an ideal summer day for me would be spending a day down with my family at Clovelly Beach, and I wish I could be spending more time down there. On a positive side, the whole of the eastern suburbs, I think, is greener now than it was 30 years ago. Councils and residents alike are focused on planting and even bringing bees back, and we have recycling now. And I think about what it was like growing up in Hewlett Street when we were there. And I remember my family did a huge renovation at Hewlett Street, and we dug out the backyard. And when you were digging out the backyard, the amount of rubbish that people had dumped in their backyards as fillers was absolutely huge. And those kinds of habits are now no longer there at all. As I said, we now have recycling. But again, there is a lot less dumped rubbish, and I think that our councils are doing a really remarkable job. These days, there's also a lot more female sporting opportunities. It's terrific to see all the young women who are now playing rugby and the contributions that women are now making to lifestyle. to lifesaving. When I was younger, netball was really the only sport that you could play. And I'll have my last sort of little photo here. The photo in the middle is me playing netball. And as I said, growing up, netball was really the only sport that girls could really play. And I played netball my entire life. My nieces play netball. It's absolutely wonderful. I still play netball now. I think one of the great things that's happened in society is the opportunities for women's sport has greatly expanded. I am a surf lifesaver down at Clovelly, and I absolutely love it. And to the right, you are looking at a photo of me playing rugby for Sydney University, and that's a photo of me from 2013. And we continue to see women's sport expanding around the eastern suburbs. Randwick Rugby now has their own women's team. East has their own women's team. I think that this is absolutely phenomenal. But yeah, the world has changed. The eastern suburbs is changing. Our cultures are changing. I think that it is lovely. But again, I think what I've learned, and I'm really thankful for this opportunity to have done this, because it's allowed me a moment to sit down with my mother and her family. And one of the biggest things that I've taken away from this is, even though the world has changed a lot, where my family's base has not. And again, I go back to it. Even though I would say that, yeah, my lifestyle is very different now to what my mother's was, the huge amount of time that we spend around Clovelly has absolutely remained the same. So I'll leave it there, and I'll just say thank you very much for this opportunity, and I hope that everyone has enjoyed that.
Thank you very much, Marjorie. That was such a personal story that you've shared with us, and I do resonate with the fact that going out once a week did become a treat after I was about 10 as well. It was an absolute treat to go out once a week with my family to eat somewhere, but never for breakfast. So some things don't change. At the moment, we have one question in the Q&A. It's some feedback from Carol. Hi Marjorie, loving hearing your family history, how times have changed. Once we had more hospitals, Crown Street and St Margaret's, which, as you mentioned, we were both born at St Margaret's, Eastern Suburbs, Royal South Sydney, and of course Prince Henry. So that was one thing that I think Carol picked up that we probably spoke about in the rehearsals, but it's something that's resonating with her as well. I had a question, as we discussed earlier on, something that came to me when I read your maiden speech, and it was a wonderful agenda that you laid out. I was just interested because having worked with Pauline Kirby when she researched the history of Randwick for the council's sesquicentenary, one of the political intrigue cases that came up in her research was the story of the first MP for Coogee, Hyman Goldstein. As people would recognise, Goldstein Reserve has been named after him, and I was just wondering if you'd want to elaborate on that case and the connection to Coogee.
Yeah, so people might be aware that the first member for Coogee was a man by the name of Hyman Goldstein. He was a national member of parliament who represented the electorate from 1927 until his death in 1928. And he'd previously served as the elected member for the district, Eastern Suburbs district, from 1922 to 25. Now, his time in Parliament ended when he was found dead in 1928 at the bottom of Coogee Cliffs in what was considered at the time an incredibly mysterious circumstance. At the time, it wasn't sure whether or not he had been murdered or if he had taken his own life. And what's interesting is that a man by the name of Thomas Levy, who Goldstein was, it was expected that Goldstein was going to come out and reveal some sort of dodgy dealings that Thomas Levy had been doing. And so it is assumed that Goldstein was murdered by his then former business partner. And I think it's interesting because there's a couple of sides of why this story is interesting and why Goldstein is an important character, I think, for the Eastern Suburbs. On one hand, the election of a Jewish man who was born in London, I think, speaks a lot about the area in terms of our commitment for diversity and inclusion, that we had, that the first member of parliament was a Jewish man born in London. I think that speaks volumes of the area, that was the person that was elected. But I think then the other side of it is the fact that the first member of parliament was murdered also gives a little bit of dark history to the Eastern Suburbs. And you put that in the context as well as the shark arm. And so like the Eastern Suburbs has quite a rich history, we might want to say, when it comes to some underhandedness, we might just say,
or history of true crime, I think we'll call it, which fascinates a lot of people in the library. And as you know, we already had the shark new book, the author, so people can actually catch up with that on the council's website as well. But we have a couple of other thoughtful questions from people listening as well. Sue is asking, Marjorie, at what age did you start to get interested in politics? Obviously, there was a strong family orientation there for progressive ideas. So.
It's a really good question, because I don't necessarily think there was a single moment that I said I want to become involved in politics. There's always been a really strong sense of community in my family and the importance of giving back to the community. And I see being involved in a formal political position as just an extension of that. My parents, our entire life, have always been the kinds of people who have encouraged us to just get involved and do things that build and make our community stronger. So I think probably one of the first sort of major things that I can remember going to was around getting polls underground. But I have to say, there was no single moment in which I can ever think I want to get involved in politics, because for my entire life, involvement in community and making our community a better place has always been something that has been like very deeply instilled in us as kids.
I think that really came through in your maiden speech. It really did set a great agenda for your time in Parliament. Kerry is also asking, Marjorie, how has your family history in the area impacted on you as a politician in this area?
Look, firstly, I have to say it is an absolute privilege to serve a community that is in your DNA. When I'm standing up and I'm talking about beaches, or I'm talking about hospitals, or I'm talking about schools, I'm talking about the beaches that my grandparents swam at, I'm talking about the schools that my sisters and brothers have been to and have taught at, I'm talking about the schools that my uncles and aunties have been to. This isn't just a place that I live in, it's in my DNA. I was brought up here. These are the streets that I walk at. These are the shops that I shop at. These are the trees that give me oxygen and my family oxygen. So I think whenever it's an incredibly powerful thing. And it's really special for me when I stand up and I talk about the community, because it's a community, as I said, that is literally in my DNA. And it gives you a huge amount of pride, but it's also a lot of responsibility, because there's a legacy of people that have come before me that have lived around here. And I want to make sure that their legacies are upheld, and that, when I leave this place, regardless, and I mean it, not just as a politician, but as a person and a member of the community, I want to leave it better than how I came into it. And I think that's really, really important, because it's you know, it's about everyone that's been here and respecting the history and the heritage as well.
That's a great ethos to have. Very inspiring, actually. There's no more questions from the floor, so I actually might just join in a vote of thanks, Marjorie, for joining us this evening and sharing such a personal story and a passion for the eastern suburbs of Sydney, and especially Coogee and Clovelly Cove. I'll put a shout out to everyone that you have actually told us that you'll share any of the images of Clovelly over the years so that we can spot the changes in the landscape in Clovelly for all time. It has been a great example for us, your presentation, highlighting the value of history and particularly family history in illustrating the theme of History Week this year, which is what is history good for? And I think you've shown us tonight a perfect example of what we can do with history when we put our mind to it.